Hello and welcome. It is my absolute favorite week to teach because this is social psychology. This is the thing that my degree is actually in. I got a big fancy piece of paper that says my name and social psychology on it, which means that I know a lot about this. I'm a doctor of it, even. My master's is in psychology, my bachelor's is in psychology, but those are broad survey degrees. This is where my actual expertise is. This is where I live. I have forgotten more about this than most people will ever know. And let's get started then. All right. This is also going to be a long one, so just like buckle up, maybe get some hot cocoa. If you need to step away and take a break, I'll understand. And if you're watching the archive, feel free to pause and come back. All right. So, what are we going to talk about more broadly? Social psychology is a massive field that spans basically everything. Kind of like how when we said developmental psychology is just anything plus time. Social psychology is anything plus people. Anything that has a social component, anything that involves any number of people from 2 to 10 to 20 to 30 to 10 million is social psychology. So when we're going to get here and trying to pare it down into something that I can fit into one stream, we're going to talk about social influence. We're going to talk about helping and harming other people. We're going to talk about attitudes and persuasion, and then we're going to round out with prejudice and discrimination, which is, my sub area of expertise, as it were. So, getting kicked in, social psychology. What the heck are we talking about? We are talking about the study of how people influence other people. Basically, behaviors, beliefs, attitudes, even the imagined presence of other people, or anything like that. It's even bigger in practice, like I said, anything plus other people, even if the people are only in your head, is social psychology. Because people don't have to be present to influence you. We got a whole conversation we could have even about parasocial relationships, and that's going to happen eventually at some point. I've been working on another talk about that specifically. We are, as humans, intensely social creatures. We depend on groups for survival, and exile is painful, sometimes even deadly. We have a core psychological need to form interpersonal connections with people. We do so easily and we do so readily. This is called the need to belong theory, which posits that we need to belong. A major motivator for us is trying to establish interpersonal connections with the people around us. It hurts. Whether or not people intend to or don't intend to, social rejection is painful, sometimes even physically. So why are we wired this way? Well, there are a couple of different theories. Obviously, there's the evolutionary psych theory here that's saying that, we're wired to make these connections because making those connections makes it much easier to survive in a state of nature. But it's not just that. Remember when we talked about self-esteem? Well, Mark Leary has developed a theory called sociometer theory, which posits that the reason we even have self-esteem is because it operates as a kind of a gauge, a measure of how we're doing socially. If we feel like we're fitting in, if people are laughing at our jokes and things are going well, then we tend to feel better about ourselves, and that boosts up our self-esteem. In other words, we have self-esteem to measure how well we are fitting in. And when we're not fitting in, when our jokes don't land, when people don't watch our streams and all that, it hurts. Emotionally, physically, and all that. And that is a motivator then for us to try to fit back in, to boost up our self-esteem and all that. So even when we talk about stuff like things that might seem on surface, like they're very individualistic, like something like self-esteem, no, there's a social component to that too. There's a whole theory out there, many theories in fact, this is just one of them, that would say that the reason we have self-esteem, the reason that we feel good about ourselves or bad about ourselves, is to give us a way of measuring how well we're fitting in with the group. Because we are just that hardwired to want that, to seek affirmation and to seek approval. Because we are a social species. And most of our processes of social influence are adaptive, even beneficial most of the time. I mean, let's think about this. When we talked about heuristics, right? We talked about like all the kinds of shortcuts that we take that allow us to get through the day and save processing power in our brains. Well, it turns out social influence and relying on other people and what they think and going with the flow is a very easy way to save resources as well. A lot of the ways that people influence us have real positive impact most of the time, but not all the time, because these can become maladaptive or dangerous, especially when they are not questioned. And you can run off the cliff like lemmings, even if that didn't actually happen, and Disney killed a bunch of lemmings to make that famous clip happen. If I take a break there, I'm sipping some hot chocolate. This is a long one. I gotta keep my energy up. So broadly, social psychology, social influence, not a bad thing. Can be a very bad thing though. So why do we end up doing some of these background social processes? Remember when I said that the person doesn't even have to be present in order to have an impact on us? Social comparison is a major way that ends up being manifested in our day-to-day psychological experience. We have a constant need to evaluate ourselves to others. It happens all the time, and unless you are actively trying not to do it, you are probably going to end up making some kind of comparison to the people around you. Looking at whether or not where are people going on your commute? How is traffic going? Maybe you just started a new job and you're looking at the flow of where people are going to make sure you're going to the right spot in the office. We also have needs for self-esteem. Sometimes we compare ourselves upwards or downwards to people around us to get a little boost. There's all kinds of reasons that we do this, but we are very keenly attuned to how other people are doing and what they're doing, because we just want to make sure that we are fitting in with a group. Called social comparison. Traditionally, we can compare to people that we see as better than us or inferior to us, and then upwards or downward social comparison. Now, there is some thought traditionally that upward social comparison was kind of a mystery. No one really knew why we did it. Because after all, you think, okay, well, you're going to compare yourself. Why would you compare yourself to somebody that's better than you at something? It's only going to make you feel worse in comparison, right? But the answer is that isn't necessarily true. It's possible, but not true. So let's just say, for example, you're a streamer here on twitch.tv, and you are struggling. You're not necessarily hitting the metrics that you want to hit. You're really not doing great, and you have a friend. And your friend is doing so much better than you. They're just taking off, it's been 2 months, they're already applying for a partner, and you're looking at them and you're thinking, God, I must suck. But not necessarily. Because if you're close to that person, if you identify that person as being part of your in-group, that can actually boost your self-esteem. If they did it, I can do it too. They're my friend and I'm happy for them. Or maybe you supported them at some critical point. And there's all kinds of ways that you can upwardly compare to somebody, but not end up putting yourself down, especially if you see yourself as having something in common with the person that you're comparing to. When it comes to downward social comparison, though, it's a little bit more self-explanatory. Oftentimes, people will find themselves, especially if they're feeling a little bit low, trying to find somebody else that might have it worse. Maybe you're running late to work, but somebody else on the train as you're stressed out and you're checking your email on your phone, you see someone spill coffee on themselves and you're like, well, at least I'm not that guy. It happens. People do it. And oftentimes we do it habitually and without really having to think about it because, again, our brains are wired to make these kinds of comparisons all the damn time. Which leads to some interesting points because we tend to also look to other people to get information, right? It's not just about self-esteem and self-evaluation. When we find ourselves in ambiguous situations, we tend to look to other people to see how we should act or how we should feel. Let's say you're flying, you're already anxious, there's a whole pandemic going on, and it is a bumpy ride. If you're like me, you don't fly a lot. And turbulence weirds me out. I don't like being on roller coasters either because I'm out of control. I don't know what I'm doing or where the plane is going. I'm not steering it. So I'm prone to get really tense about turbulence. Well, guess what? Turns out we, in those situations, look to other people to see how they are responding. And if you're sitting there and you're freaking out and you got knots in your stomach over turbulence, and you look over to the person next to you and they're just kind of chilling, they got their headphones on, listening to an audiobook. Maybe they downloaded this lecture and they're listening to it and they're listening to the soothing sound of my voice. Then you're going to think, wow, that person seems like really calm and really collected. I should go check out that streamer and watch all of her videos. But this can also lead to mass hysteria because when we find ourselves in ambiguous situations, if people start behaving irrationally, people tend to come up with hysterical responses in order if they see other people behaving irrationally. The Salem witch trials are a big example of this, but you can also see any of this around, especially stuff like COVID. We're swimming in real life examples of this. We were in an ambiguous situation. Think back in March 2020. No one really knows what's going on. We don't know much about this virus. Things are shutting down. We're in these weird situations. There's conflicting misinformation going around. And all of a sudden, people start coming up with sort of very hive-mindy, irrational behavior, or what might seem like irrational behavior if you're not in the same social circles as they are. But if you're in them and you're looking around and you're seeing people say the vaccine is going to turn you gay or whatever people are saying, if that's what the people around you are saying in an ambiguous situation, that becomes something that's easier to believe. Hence what we call, and this can also lead to stuff like collective delusions. We've talked about even stuff like alien abductions before. Urban legends and all that can also be caused by social contagions. Again, something weird happens. Mystery windshield damage spreads in Seattle and the county. Oh no, there's suddenly the exploding windshields around here. Wonder, like, this creates a weird situation or a weird bit of news. People read it, they form their own opinions, they talk to other people, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And it's how stuff like Bigfoot and everything stays around. People have a weird experience camping, someone tells them Bigfoot's in these woods, and then suddenly you have someone else believing in Bigfoot. Yeah, it happens. It happens again all the time. Now, it's not all bad, though. It actually turns out that the presence of other people can actually help us do better than we ever would do on our own. Called social facilitation. The mere presence, I'm going to use that term a couple of times in this talk. The mere presence means that someone doesn't have to do anything. They can simply turn around, they can just be there. Your friend is just hanging out, not even paying attention to you while you're up in a bicycle race, can have a facilitating effect and get you to really give 110%. We've actually done this, we, as in psychologists, this is the part of the lecture where I say we. Social psychologists will do stuff where they'll take somebody and they'll take them out to a racetrack. Like a track and field thing, you know, but not for horses, for people, you know, and have them run it and see what their best time is. And then they'll see what happens if there are other people there watching them run. And the people in general get faster. They're performing for a crowd now. And then they'll bring them back a third time. And they'll have the people there, but they have all the people turn around. So they're only running, like the person is running and all they can see is people's backs. No one is actually watching them run, but just because there are other people there, still gets this facilitation effect. They don't even have to be paying attention. They can just be there. And this is true of non-human animals as well. Cockroaches do this in a maze. If you have cockroaches running a maze, they will get faster if there are other cockroaches around. It's wild. I love this shit. But you can also choke. People get stressed out at the presence of other people. And this might have to do with the Yerkes-Dodson law that we talked about with motivation as well. There's sort of a sweet spot for this kind of stuff. You want to be aroused, but not too aroused. If there's not enough going on, you're bored. If there's too much, you're stressed out. So performing in front of a couple people that you know is a lot easier than performing to an audience of strangers, especially a stadium full of strangers. And so there's some nuance to this. We call these boundary conditions or moderators. So, but it does generally hold true that we tend to do better when performing to other people. It's like maybe you've had this experience. I've definitely had it before, where you're prepping for a meeting. It's very important. You're going to give a presentation and you're just not sure. You're feeling a little bit anxious, but you get in there, you start going, people are paying attention to you, and you just nail it. Slam dunk, best run of this talk you have ever given. And it's probably because, again, social facilitation. It's different to give this talk to people versus giving this talk to a room of strangers. Now, this is going to be, again, this is sort of a shotgun approach, so I'm going to be kind of switching gears pretty readily on this one. So the fundamental attribution error is a fun one. We do this all the time. People tend to, we make attributions, we assign causes to behavior, either to internal causes, the person is just like this, or external influence, you know, this person is maybe having a rough day or something like that. There are outside factors that are kicking in. For other people, we tend to overestimate their internal motivations. And we underestimate situational influences. Maybe you have a streamer You come into their chat for the first time and you ask them how they're doing. And they say, who the fuck are you, you little weirdo? Give me money and like, or don't talk to me. It's probably happened, right? Streaming's a wild world. Now you might walk away from that experience and you might say, wow, that person sucks. Because you're overestimating their individual influences. What you might not know is that maybe this person just got hate rated, they're being harassed, or they're struggling in some other area of life. Maybe rent is due and this is how they make their living and they're coming up short. You never know. But when it comes to our own behavior, whoop. How did I jump all the way down here? Technically, like, I don't think I've ever done that in a PowerPoint before. Hey, I'm so good at this. There we go. We tend to do this differently for our own behavior. We call it the self-serving bias. We tend to overestimate disposition, like we tend to underestimate this power of the situation and overestimate the factors of our situation. Yeah, it's like, oh, that's a good example too. So you got a good example here in the chat. You happen to get a donation, ask them to say a specific line, and they just don't do it, or they give you a snappy response. What you don't know is that people keep donating for this thing, and this is your first time coming in, but like they are freaking sick of it, and they don't want to do it anymore. Like, please stop asking me to do this thing. So that can happen. But for our own behavior, we tend to do the opposite. We tend to, if we fail, we explain away our failure, but we internalize our successes. Interestingly enough, for people that show symptoms of clinical depression, they tend to do the opposite. And I have definitely, as someone who has dealt with depression for most of her life, had to reckon with this as well. I will go through phases where I will completely internalize my failures and explain away my successes because, yeah, it's a goofy thing, kind of foreshadowing a bit of the clinical topic that we're going to be getting into next week, but it's an interesting point because when I learned this, I was like, I do not do that when someone explained the self-serving bias. So I raised my hand in class and I said, that's weird because I never do that. I do the exact opposite. And then the professor stopped and said, yeah, that's usually a thing with people that have clinical depression. If I was editing this, there'd be a Zoom gag there, but yeah, that was a fun call out. Yeah, the hard read, right? So getting back into social pressure, let's talk about conformity. Conformity broadly means altering your behavior to be consistent with the people around you. And conformity is a long-standing subject of interest in social psychology. So give me 1 second here. I'm going to go jump over to a very classic example of conformity. So let's jump over. Whoop, here we go. Yep, we're there. Thank you, Dova Syndrome, for always providing the wonderful tunes for these. Let's get into the Ash experiment. We're going to watch a little bit of this, probably watch the whole thing, and then we're going to unpack a little bit of what we're seeing here, because conformity, very important subject going forward. We're going to get into a whole subject here about social influence. Let me know if you can hear this, and also let's hit those closed captions.
But an experiment is not a public opinion poll. It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white T-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2. 2. 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence. Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1.
They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1.
1.
1.
2.
1. 2. 2.
2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2.
2.
2.
2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1. 1.
2.
1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner.
Not in this video.
Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership
man.
variation shows
Got
that
it.
much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with the group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of
I love their
misleading
fashion,
information
too.
as other subjects, but they are
It was a
immune
better
from any
time.
possible criticism by the group.
1.
1. 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
All right. I know these are absolutely the best fits, right? Absolutely the best fits, but also some good info in there. I'm a big fan of the Ash studies. They're very fun to talk about. So let's get back over and talk about conformity a little bit more. So now you know with Ash's study. So if I were to come up and I were to ask you now, hey, you know, which of these lines is different? Odds are you'd all give the same answer, right? You'd say 2. It's obvious. But what's promising, I think interesting about Ash's study is that it is so obvious, and yet people will still make the wrong choice. Except in that one trial where you had the buddy and the guy looks over like, yeah, man, I got you. It's 2 and everyone else is saying 1, but I know, I feel you. It's like if you're a fan of JoJo's when Caesar sends the bubble in part 2, it's like that. That's the same energy that was happening there. Anyway, I love, like, also just because of the time period, you get great photographs of this. Like, I love the guy in the middle. Like, this is the trial where you get it wrong and everyone looks at you and is like, come on, dude. It's obviously 1. This guy over here, this smart aleck over here thinks that he's smarter than all of us and saying it's 2. Who does this guy think he is, right? You know, it's wonderful. I love it. Great times, great experiments. Anyway. So what does the power of the group actually look like? So this is the percentage of trials in which the subject conformed. And it turns out that the number of opponents that it takes to get someone to get an optimal amount of conformity, and now you might say, 30% of trials isn't that much. Like, why does that matter? This matters because this isn't even an ambiguous situation. This is giving an obviously wrong response that the person knows is obviously wrong. And they're doing it about a third of the time if even 3 people disagree with them. However, when you do have situations where maybe even one other person disagrees, and even if they pick a different wrong response, breaking the uniformity of the group does a great deal to break down these factors of conformity. The size of the majority does matter. Once you get above about 3 people, there's a pretty steep diminishing return, but you know how it goes. Self-esteem, once again, also comes in here again. Remember, sociometry theory says that self-esteem signals that we are not fitting in with the group, and so people that are lower in self-esteem tend to be more prone to conform in these kinds of experiments. Also importantly, there's no sex differences here. I know there's some pop psych stuff about like women being warmer and more pro-social or whatever. Does not happen here. Men and women and non-binary folks and everyone in between are just as likely to conform because conformity is baked into the human condition. We do it all the time without having to think about it. But this even comes into factors of de-individuation, because as we engage in behaviors where we are part of a group, it becomes easier to conform. It becomes easier to not really think about ourselves as having our own opinion, but rather we're trying to forward and accomplish a group agenda. So when you give someone something that conceals their identity, like a mask, maybe, it diminishes their sense of personal responsibility and can make people more vulnerable to social influence. Think about online comment sections. What if, hypothetically, you could just go on the internet and load up VTube Studio and just present yourself as anyone or anything to an audience of people without having to put your actual face out there? What if you went even one step further and you didn't even have a profile picture or anything iconic with yourself? It's like, by having that kind of anonymity that goes along with the internet, people, especially in online comment sections, will say things that they would never do otherwise. Because once you've been stripped of your individual identity, people tend to be capable of some pretty messed up things. You know, if you're in the United States or just familiar with them, the Klan shows up in a lot of social psych textbooks as an example of people being capable of doing horrific acts of domestic terrorism once their faces are hidden. Which played a pretty big role. De-individuation played a pretty significant role in the Stanford prison study. Now, a lot of people will spend a lot of time on this study when doing their social psych lecture. I don't, because I think it's a pretty shit study, all in all. And I think that a lot of the same lessons are learned from other better executed work. Also, Zimbardo asked a friend of mine to sit on his lap at a conference, so I tried to talk about him as little as possible. But it's in all the textbooks, so I have to brush on it. So in the Stanford prison study, the researchers recruited normal young men, gave them all psychological tests in advance to show that they were within sort of the same parameters. They were all basically normal people around the same age and attending a university in California. They were going to Stanford. And then after coming in, they were randomly assigned to be either a prisoner or a guard in a simulated prison study. There's a lot of stuff you can watch. I want to say there was even a high production film made about this because this study is a landmark in social psych. But the actual reality of it is that the study didn't go very well. By the second day, the guards, who were given, as you can see, these big aviator glasses so you couldn't see their eyes or really tell them apart, started being cruel to the prisoners who were stripped of their possessions and put in jumpsuits and all of that. By the 6th day, the study had to stop. The prisoners were having nervous breakdowns. The guards that were becoming increasingly cruel and sadistic. It was just a mess of things. Now, there is a lot of important things to keep in mind about this study and why I don't like talking about it. Because this was a time before institutional review boards, which means it was not carefully controlled. This was the Wild West of social psych, where Zimbardo and company basically said, well, what if we just took these kids and had them play act prison? There really wasn't a lot of supervision. Zimbardo was part of the study himself and actually did some things in the study that are incredibly fucked up. Because of his dual role as a participant and as a researcher, when some of these prisoners were starting to show signs of real-life trauma and wanted to leave, Zimbardo talked them out of it. It's incredibly fucked up looking back on it, that this kind of stuff happened. There's also, again, demand characteristics. People were encouraged. They gave the prison guards billy clubs. You know, they were given a role to play and they played it. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Also, a fun anecdote here, if you ever listen to the videos where Zimbardo talks about this, he was talked into stopping the study early by his partner at the time, who was also one of his graduate students. If you want to talk about dual roles, but you know, I'm gonna stop harping on Zimbardo. I think he sucks personally. Anyway, the other bit about this, and the reason I don't like talking about it, is that it generally doesn't replicate. Replication is important. Can you get the same effect later on? There was a pop media replication, didn't necessarily totally get the effect, but kind of got it. But also a more recent attempt to replicate it didn't actually get the same strength of effect. And it's hard to redo this because of ethical concerns, but it doesn't seem like the sensational effects that Zimbardo and company got out of the Stanford prison study ended up being easily reproducible later on, which is sort of the gold standard for good research. Now, despite that, Zimbardo has become an expert on this kind of stuff. Abu Ghraib, where U.S. soldiers abused prisoners, etc. I think he was called in to even be a special witness during their trials. The big takeaway is that as people get caught into these roles in these situations, we can tend to turn off our individual sense of reason and go along with the social roles that we have. It's the core, if there's one core mantra of social psychology, it's the power of the situation. The situations that we find ourselves in have incredible influence on who we are and how we act. These kids that were given billy clubs and sunglasses became cruel and sadistic in ways they never thought they could be, whereas the prisoners who were given jumpsuits and stripped of and given numbers instead of names and all of that became submissive and scared and everything. The roles that we play have a very powerful impact on how we go through our daily lives. And as we get into situations where we are de-individuated, we tend to put an emphasis on group cohesion at the expense of our critical thinking. If you go through any number of historical examples like the Bay of Pigs disaster or the Challenger explosion, we end up in these situations where, yeah, it turns out that a lot of people will heck up and will check out their critical thinking skills in favor of just going along with what the group wants, right? It's goofy. And we've probably all done this at some point, right? And you can probably think of a time where you're like, you don't want to rock the boat. You go along with the group. I mean, heaven forbid, group work, group projects in school are full of this kind of stuff. You just gotta tune out and say, you know what, whatever. I'm just gonna like go along with things as they're doing. You know, that's how it is. Anyway, but just like any kind of study in conformity, appointing a devil's advocate or someone who can just be there and like basically be the Joker and challenge the group does a lot to reduce groupthink. So having one person who's willing to stand up and say, hey, I don't think that's a good idea, even if the group was correct in the first place and they're actually wrong, that devil's advocate can at least get people to think about things more critically and not just be trying to make decisions based on what the group wants. Now there's a fun impact here though. Without a devil's advocate, groups tend to arrive at more extreme positions than the individual members ever had going in. So let's say, for example, what's a good one here? You like a movie. You're hanging out with your friends. You all individually kind of liked it. But then as you get out of the theater, you're talking about it and you're like, the more you talk about it as a group, the more you all start to like it. Your impressions become better and you all walk away thinking, that was the best movie I saw in years. And then maybe you get home or maybe later on you rewatch it by yourself and you're like, oh, this sucks actually. Yeah, it's an echo chamber. Or like basically, or a circle jerk, depending on how you want to put it. You can just put this down, you can just think about it very succinctly, is that as people tend to be on the same path, they tend to fall at a further or more extreme position than they would have individually. So even if you like it, you like the movie, if you're talking in a group and trying to make a group consensus, you're probably going to end up liking it even more just because everyone kind of pushes each other along. So how can you actually get out of groupthink? Well, part of it is recognizing it. if you see people saying that they're on the right side or the other people are wrong, thinking about the group as a whole, as just one unit that cannot fail, everyone agrees, and all that, you know, probably a sign of bad things to come. So if you find yourself in this kind of situation where someone's saying that they're on the right side of things and everyone agrees and all that, yeah. Maybe the one time you're not an asshole to play devil's advocate. We finally found the one time that it's okay. Interesting that you just brought up Hololive Cadenza, because let's talk about cults for a second. Cults, right? Cults are an extension of groupthink. Groups that exhibit intense, unquestioning devotion to a single cause. Now, what's interesting is that groupthink tends to apply to cults in usually about 4 ways. You have a persuasive leader who's fostering loyalty, that disconnects members from the outside world, discourages questioning and gradually indoctrinates members into a cohesive unit that sees themselves as a cohesive unit. And rocking the boat is very bad if you're in a cult. Usually what's interesting though is like when we think about cults, and especially, I mean, I'm one of those people that gets into these YouTube rabbit holes. If you ever get into like a YouTube or a podcast rabbit hole about the history of cults, or people talk about cult members, like especially surviving cult members, what you're going to find is that usually the people that get involved in these situations are not emotionally disturbed. They are normal people because cults tend to prey on the same kind of social wiring that we all have. And even all the stuff about being brainwashed and needing to be deprogrammed doesn't necessarily hold up. It's not real in the phenomenal sense that people think about it, because it turns out, again, cults and cultish behavior are the results of very normal social responses that we all have. Now, inoculation effects like exposing to other people's beliefs, like we were talking about playing devil's advocate and all that, do work here as well. But the general truth is that a lot of what we think about is very outlandish or even like bizarre or unusual behavior, like with cults or alternative religions, really is just the normal functionings of our social brains in most cases. And when you think ever go out and check out some podcasts or anything where people talk about cults and cultish behavior, I'm always floored by how much I could see myself getting pulled into one of these kind of situations, because I know that I am not above groupthink, and I am not above these kinds of social dynamics and a want for approval and all of that. Which transitions into obedience. When we are following orders from someone who's in either an imagined or an actual position of authority, we call that obedience. And it is essential to our daily functioning. Generally, when it comes to most social situations, we need to have some kind of hierarchy or some kind of chain of command in order to most efficiently handle whatever problems we are in. But that can be troublesome when obedience overrides our reasoning, which leads us to the Milgram Study. This is, again, another fun one that you've probably all heard of. Oh, I did the thing again. Whoa. This is what I get for having the fancy new mechanical clacky keyboard. Sometimes I hit the end button and it takes me to the last slide when I'm going for page up, page down. So I guess that's what's actually happening. Here we go. The Milgram Study. So Milgram was a student of Ash, who is sort of the... Well, we've talked about him. One of the most seminal figures in social psychology, Solomon Asch. We talked about his own studies on conformity. And Stanley Milgram was an ambitious student. And he had a big question. He wanted to understand why people showed unquestioning obedience to Nazi officers. And so he wanted to test the impact of social influence on obedience to authority in normal people. Subjects were brought into a lab. They're introduced to a volunteer, who tells the person that, I'm just a normal guy. They basically bring Columbo in to be the volunteer. I'm just a normal guy, but I got a heart condition, just so you know. I don't know why you need to know that, but I'm going to make sure to tell you that I have a heart condition. The volunteer then leaves, is brought to a different room. The volunteer is a Confederate. They're in on the story. The teacher then sits the actual participant down and puts on a white lab coat. And they tell the person this is a learning study. The person in the other room with the heart condition, they are the learner. You're going to read them word pairs. When they get something wrong, you're going to press a switch on this board and you're going to shock them. And every time they get it wrong, you're going to give them a progressively more intense electrical shock. Now, there was no electrical shock, but the Confederate, a very good actor, would scream, would yell, would sound like they were in pain. Eventually, they would tell the person, you gotta stop, I have a heart condition, my heart is hurting me, you might kill me. Well, what actually happened? Let's bounce back over to the other screen real quick. And we are there. This is a fun one. You know, in the way that at least this one was a good study. Yeah, these are, if you've heard of any social psych experiments, you've probably heard of Milgram and you've probably heard of the Stanford prison study. All right, let's get into it.
The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was in the Veterans Hospital in West Haven. And while there, they detected a heart condition. There's nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator.
Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is to do a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock 1 step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105. Hard head. Just how far can you go in this thing? As far as is necessary. What do you mean, as far as is necessary?
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now, this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now, other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts, Jim.
Please continue.
Some psychologists were troubled by the ethics of it. Many, if not most subjects, found it a highly stressful, conflicted experience. People are stammering, stuttering, laughing hysterically, inappropriately.
150 volts.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out.
Smiles evilly.
Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Clearly, when we say people went to the top of the chalkboard, it wasn't like they were going blithely, sadistically. People went stop and go, stop and go. They were in a state of conflict, which created a tremendous amount of stress. So that was the main critique.
This will be at 3:30.
As his voice began to show increasing frustration, so did I. And I was really in a state of real conflict and agitation. One of Stanley Milgram's basic contributions was that you don't ask people what they would do given this hypothetical situation. You put them in the situation.
Wrong. I want the 180 volts. Please continue, teacher. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there.
According to Milgram, one of the things that's a prerequisite for carrying out acts that are evil is to shed responsibility from your shoulders and hand it over to the person in charge.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow.
He didn't hold any gun to anybody's head. Just the fact that he conveyed a sense of authority. Roughly 60-65% of the people went all the way to the top of the shock board.
450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer. Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there.
Milgram made the point, I think very effectively, that the Nazis weren't all a bunch of psychopaths at Belsen and Dachau. A death camp from the middle class in New Haven.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch? I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said he's got to keep going.
What kind of obedience would Milgram get today if he were to do the experiment today?
Probably about the same.
Probably about the same. Why?
I don't know. I think people are just inherently obedient.
It just really shows like how far human beings will go to appease what they perceive to be an authority figure.
Milgram has identified one of the constants, one of the universals of social behavior. The readiness to obey authority cuts across time. It's a constant. The other outstanding and distinctive thing about the obedience experiment is how much it has and keeps on permeating contemporary culture and thought. It's still with us in very, very important ways.
And that one's true. That's actually very true. This study sticks around. Much like the Stanford prison study does, this one I prefer to talk about just because it's, honestly, I think it's better research. That's the crux of it. I think it's better controlled, it's better done, it's more let's just say it's a easier thing to talk about. There were IRBs, there were some defenses in mind. People were like, it's actually they came to a conclusion. It's the big one. Did you actually finish the study? So what can we learn from here? Well, it turns out that when it came down to how things broke down, the percentage of the subjects who actually obeyed the study, again, it goes down over time, because as you're going through, people will press the button and they're given a soundbite, they're given a clip that progressively shows more pain, more anguish, until eventually the person just stops responding and they're told to just keep going. Well, presumably they've killed a person, and people were traumatized by this study. It's one of the reasons, much like the Stanford prison study, it's very hard to get a replication of Milgram's work through an IRB, because part of it, to make it a true direct replication, you need to let people believe they've killed someone, at least for a while. And even if you tell the person afterwards in the debriefing, it was all a game. We were just joshing. We were just, it's all made up. The person's fine. The person goes home then with the belief and so knowing that they could, if in this position, be convinced to kill someone. Kind of, it's a hard thing to live with. But yeah, about 65% of people went all the way to the end of the board. What's interesting about this is that this is something you're probably not going to get in your on paper class. Stanley Milgram was an ambitious student. This was what he did in grad school, and his explicit goal was to be a famous psychologist. He didn't just want to be a normal dude. He didn't just want to get his doctorate and get tenure. He wanted to be famous. And to do that, part of this, the lead-in to what we call now the Milgram Obedience Study, I almost said Stanford Prison Study, the Milgram Obedience Study was that he actually went through a media tour. He brought people on and he said, what percentage of people do you think will go all the way to the end of this? And what people found leading up to it was that, many experts and other psychologists said, less than 1% of people, only true sociopaths and ne'er-do-wells and all that will go all the way to the end. And then he comes up with this data that says 65% of people, if put in a position where a figure of authority tells them to do something, will do something that they believe is causing harm to another human being. Now, there were a number of follow-ups because Milgram, to his credit, was a pretty good researcher on this kind of stuff. So looking to make greater psychological distance between the teacher and experimenter resulted in less obedience. Let's say you had 3 rooms. The teacher is the person in the lab coat is in one room. They're telling you to continue over an intercom while you're sitting there. That's much different than having the person in the room with you. And then also having less psychological distance between the teacher and the learner also resulted in more obedience. If you were shocking the person in the room with you, people were much less likely to do it. If they couldn't see it, in other words, the closer you believe the experimenter is, the more likely you are to obey. And the more de-individuated, the more you can just imagine that person isn't really a person, the more likely people were to obey as well. And then there were other bits, levels of authoritarianism and moral development also play in, but in general, people tended to go along. And again, through all the follow-ups, there are no cultural or sex differences here. And what's interesting is that there actually was, to my knowledge, a recent replication of Milgram's work that did come back. I think the results were slightly attenuated off the top of my head. I should have looked this up. But the core idea still works. So we asked the question, would we get the same levels of obedience today? Maybe not the same levels. Maybe not exactly. But we do tend to see the same effect. Obedience is a real thing. Obedience and authority do still work out in the same way that Milgram was interested in. So let's pivot away from obedience for a second, talk about other social interactions. Because sometimes there isn't necessarily a figure of authority to tell us what to do, and we have to kind of intuit what's going on from the people around us. This can lead to what we call the bystander effect or bystander non-intervention, which is when we see someone in need, but we fail to help them. Maybe you've heard of Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese was murdered in New York in a series of repeated attacks over 35 minutes. They're in front of an apartment building. It was witnessed by many people. Very few called the police, and no one actually went to intervene by law. This has led to a number of studies in the bystander effect because this actually happened and was a national sensation. Because people were talking about how cities were not safe, but also this kick-started again a national conversation of like, oh, we used to be a society. We used to be a honest society, and now this kind of stuff can happen. But it turns out that what happened with Kitty Genovese being murdered and the people in the nearby apartment building hearing her crying for help but no one going to intervene really might be part of a core psychological and sociological phenomenon that we call the bystander effect. Basically, we look to other people and we tend to assume that other people might be doing something. And when we're in these individual there are these ambiguous situations, it is hard for people to imagine taking individual action. Take, for example, a series of studies where people were placed in a room either alone or in a group. And because psychologists love fucking with people, let's say you're a Confederate, you're an undergrad, you're brought into a lab, they sit you in the waiting room and they say, all right, just chill, we're going to sit here, and we'll call you in a little bit. And then they start pumping smoke into the room from under the door, as if there's a fire in the next room. Well, the people that are in the room alone, about 75% of them tend to respond to the emergency. That drops to about 10% if there are other people in the room that aren't paying attention to the smoke. Similar numbers for when people see a woman in distress, or if you're in same room, same setup, but another student, while you're sitting there waiting for a study, starts showing signs of having a seizure. People tend to do something when they're alone. They don't tend to do something when they're in groups if the other people in that group aren't responding. Oh God, did I do the thing again? Well, at least this, now we're closer to the end. So there are two main factors. Pluralistic ignorance is a big one. If no one else is reacting, we just kind of infer that other people know what they're doing. And also the diffusion of responsibility. We recognize that other people are in the room, and we don't know what to do about it because somebody else will probably do it, right? You're in a room of 5 people, there's smoke coming under the door, and no one knows, like, no one does anything? Well, you just assume it's either not a big deal or someone else has already done something. So here's a bit of applied knowledge. If you're ever in a situation like this, try to call out to people and give people explicit individual instructions. If you're in a situation, let's say a medical emergency, let's use the same one here. You're in a room with other people, someone starts having a seizure. If you point to one person and you say, you call 911, odds are 911 will get a phone call that wouldn't have happened if you had gone and just said, well, someone else is probably going to do something, right? A professor of mine actually saved someone at a conference who was having a medical issue by just pointing to one other person at the bar and saying, you, do this. And that got an ambulance there quicker than it probably would have happened otherwise. This can also lead to what we call social loafing, because when we don't see ourselves as individuals, we just see ourselves as acting as part of a group, people tend to minimize the amount of effort that they put in. In fact, in actual practice, the whole is often less than the sum of its parts. Whether it's cheerleaders slacking off or people playing tug of war, when people feel that responsibility is diffused around the group, they tend to care less about the overall outcome. Hands up in the air if you've ever played an instrument. I played trombone in concert band, and when I had to give recitals or solos, I was on that shit. But if I was just playing in the band, I didn't practice as hard. I didn't care as much because I saw myself as just being part of a group, and so there was less motivation for me to actually really go and give my all. So how do we deal with this? It's kind of the same kind of core idea that we see kind of permeating throughout here, reminding people of their individual responsibility or giving people some level of personal ownership or personal investment is a way of dealing with social loafing and other related phenomenons. Okay, sip of that hot chocolate. Oh, that's so good. So there is a line to draw between pro-social behavior and altruism. When we talk about altruism, it's selflessness, but pro-sociality is just helping other people. We can help people for any number of reasons. We can help them because we just simply see ourselves as being in their shoes because we are empathic, or we can help people based on situational factors. Maybe we see ourselves as personally similar to the victim, or if the room is, let's say the experimental room when that person is having a seizure is locked, then you're going to be more likely to probably kick in and do the pro-social behavior of trying to help the person because you can't escape the situation and you don't anticipate help coming in. We also call this the enlightenment effect, where exposure to research can actually change people's real-world behavior. So because you have sat and watched me talk about bystander non-intervention, odds are you are now, when you find yourself in a situation, going to be more likely to actually not fall into that mental rut. By having watched this lecture about groupthink and conformity and all that, there is actually a real possibility you are less likely to fall into groupthink, to conform in these situations, and so on and so forth. So you're welcome. But it's not always great. Let's talk about aggression for a second. There are many reasons that people are aggressive. People can respond to aggressive media cues, levels of arousal, drugs, temperature, interpersonal provocations, etc. We also look at personality traits. We'll talk more about personality next time, but there's kind of a little bit of a taster there. There is some connection between certain negative emotions and what we call the dark triad of personality traits, as well as impulsivity that can lead people to being more aggressive. There is some research. Again, I have to acknowledge it. It's in all the books. It doesn't necessarily plan out. It's not as clean of a picture as some books will let you believe. But there are some studies that would suggest that there is a gender difference here where men tend to engage in physical aggression and women tend to engage in relational aggression more so. So in this binary world of aggression, which is not real, but we'll go with it for now, men are more likely to be directly aggressive, maybe physically confrontational, whereas the textbook example is that whereas women will attack people's relationships and try to be petty or spread rumors or something along those lines. There is also some cultural influence, and particularly there's a term that floats around the aggression literature called the culture of honor, where people tend to be more likely to react aggressively to insults. Now, it's not always a place that goes abroad, because a lot of research that happens in the American South has found these culture of honor effects, where people, particularly in the Deep South, tend to take insults and personal slights more aggressively. I, having gone to grad school in the South, but having been raised in the American Midwest, and also tending to be a little bit of an oblivious person, almost got into a fight once while traveling through Georgia, where I neglected to hold the door for the person behind me, and they shoved it open loud enough that I could hear it smack against the wall. And then as they're walking by me, puffed out their chest, and they go like, "City boy." And then I got in my car and I left. It was a funny situation, like at the time, and even funnier looking back on it. But to be in, I was in a college town in Georgia after a major home football game. Just kind of like trying to get back to my university and my home, and having this altercation where this person, because of this odd happenstance, took it as a personal bit and then reacted very directly aggressively. And at the time I was kind of a little bit freaked out, because this is a football guy. He's big, and I'm a streamer. I can't fight. I can barely fight in video games, never mind in real life. And like there was a real concern there for me. How about that? Love applied examples. All right. Well, we're getting into the rounding out into the last subject here. I cut a couple of videos and stuff to try to keep this into a tight 90. So let's talk about my actual area of expertise. Let's talk about attitudes. So what is an attitude? This is my thing there where I could talk forever about attitudes. Even this first question, what is an attitude? I could give you an entire 2-hour lecture on just this, because I have spent way, way, way too many hours of my life pondering that question. So what is an attitude? I'm going to be very down to earth here. An attitude is how you feel towards something. There is an evaluative component, basically whether or not you think of it as being positive or negative. So we can say that we have a positive attitude or a negative attitude. It gets further broken down where we can say that there is sort of a valence. There's the positive or negative component, but then there's also other factors that some theorists will bring in. But for now, we're just going to keep it simple and say you like it or you don't. But attitudes are interestingly only moderately correlated with actual behavior. So when we try to publish attitude studies, the golden standard is to be able to show that there's a connection between the attitude you are measuring and actual factual individual behavior. Now, people tend to act on their attitudes when they are low in self-monitoring. So that can be, again, when cases of people groupthink or de-individuation, but also when those attitudes are highly accessible. If you tell somebody, hey, I want you to write an essay about your favorite ice cream flavor, and they sit there and they think like, man, I just love Rocky Road. Rocky Road is so good. It's the best flavor. It's got the nuts. It's got the marshmallows. This is my personal opinion. I'm very heavy on the Rocky Road train. and then you give me 3 flavors of ice cream, and there's Rocky Road, vanilla, and strawberry, I'm going to pick the Rocky Road because I just kept there thinking about how much I like this ice cream. And if that attitude is highly accessible, I've been thinking about it, I'm more likely to act on it. But our attitudes are not fixed. They change. They change a lot, actually. One theory for this is cognitive dissonance. So remember, our attitudes and our behaviors are only loosely correlated. So when we experience situations where our thoughts and behaviors don't match up, we tend to experience what researchers will call cognitive dissonance. It's a negative feeling. It feels bad. And if you've ever been like me, again, hands up, you catch yourself in a situation like this, you feel like a hypocrite. Like if I'm in that situation and I pick vanilla after I just wrote an essay about how much I like Rocky Road, well, then I'm probably gonna feel pretty bad about it, right? So when we find ourselves in these situations, we tend to engage in behaviors that are going to reduce dissonance, or we change our attitude. So let's say, again, you're an environmentalist, you throw away a soda can, you might try to rationalize away that sense of cognitive dissonance. So you're like, it's just one, I'm an environmentalist, I care about the environment, but I littered. Well, it's one can of soda, what does it matter? In the broad scheme of things, my individual contribution to pollution is so much less than BP or any of these major oil companies, so maybe it's not that big of a deal. It's a way of reconciling this feeling of dissonance. Or let's say, you consider yourself an honest person, but you also cheated on one of my exams. Well, you can do 2 things. You can either try to change the initial belief, maybe I'm not honest, maybe I didn't cheat, I just saw someone's answers, or you try to reconcile into a totally new cognition, actually, that dear professor sucks ass and her tests are poorly written, and I basically had to cheat or else I would fail. This is a real thing that happened to me while teaching. I had one I watched this happen in real time, basically. I had a student who very much considered themselves, they were a gifted kid. They had never gotten anything less than an A before in my class, and then they got a B on an exam. So cognition A, I am the smartest person in the room. Cognition B, but I didn't get the high score on this exam. Well, they went right to create the new thought. They said, well, the teacher is a grad student. She must suck. Like, she doesn't know how to teach. She doesn't know how to write questions. It's actually unfair that I have to take a class with a grad student and not an actual professor. And then they came to my office and told that to me. And I told them to drop my class if they disrespected me that much. But I did get to watch them work through this, because they're telling me, they start off saying, well, I've never gotten anything less than an A. I must be very smart. So they went through all the different stages. I'm very smart. There's got to be something else going on here. You're the odd factor. And then they decided that I was the reason that they weren't doing well in my class. Can you imagine that? It was not a fun experience. So one of the other ways that we think about how attitudes change is that we infer our attitudes based on our understandings of our own behavior. So we like to infer what our attitudes are based on what we do. And this is how we would typically infer another person's attitudes. We look at their behavior. So this actually accounts for a lot of cognitive dissonance. So we do something, and it might be out of whack with our attitudes, but we still did it. So we just say, well, maybe my attitude was different than I thought it was. Back to the ice cream example, maybe I picked the vanilla ice cream, even though I was thinking about how much I like Rocky Road. I might stop and think, maybe vanilla is actually my favorite. It's a huge thing. It's a big deal for us. So it's like in those situations, yeah, sometimes our self-perceptions can shift and we'll infer our attitudes based on our behaviors. Well, Mike, that's actually a very good point. So one of the detriments to attitude change, or a force in opposition of it, is actually sunk cost. The more you start to become entrenched in your own position, the more difficult it can be to change, in part because of the factors of cognitive dissonance. The more you have invested yourself into a position, the more dissonant it is to try to change. So this is a big thing in the classic cognitive, whoa, I did it again. The classic example of cognitive dissonance is waiting in line for a roller coaster. You wait for hours and hours at the amusement park to ride this ride, and after the first hour, you are so committed that you are going to ride this thing no matter what. And when you get off of it, most people will tell you it was the best ride they ever had because they have so much invested in it. Right? We do it all the time. Another thing here, again, impression management. We don't change our attitude. Sometimes we just want to be publicly consistent, and that might be another way of resolving dissonance. Now, it's not always our own decision when we change our attitudes. Sometimes people persuade us, and there are a lot of different ways to persuade somebody. Dual process models propose two distinct different pathways to attitude change. A central route that focuses on informational content of a message. So basically, if you're thinking a lot about something or really processing it a lot, we're in peripheral route processing, where we just focus on the surface level factors of the message. Do we like what the person looks like? Do we find them attractive? Do we see ourselves as personally similar to the person, or do they just look credible? The person, for example, who just puts on a lab coat and is telling you that you need to go shock a person is probably not going to be as persuasive if you stop and you think, well, who is this person? Are they really a doctor? You can just buy a lab coat anywhere. Anyone could be that. Like, anyone can do that. But if you're distracted or you don't have a lot of gas in the tank, people tend to focus more on, again, these surface level aspects of a message. There are some fun tricks to persuasion as well. Like my favorite bit of psychological history is that a lot of the research on persuasion was done by taking sabbaticals and talking to used car salesmen and different salesmen to see what the different techniques they used are. And that's where we get a lot of these persuasion tricks, like the foot in the door effect, where you start with a small request and gradually move on to a larger one. This works on the principle of consistency, where people like to be consistent, again, because of cognitive dissonance. If they've already agreed to a small request, well, when you ask a slightly larger and slightly larger and slightly larger request later on, they want to stay consistent. They don't want to change lanes or shift gears, and so they'll keep going along with it. There is also the door in the face effect, where you can just ask someone a huge favor and then ask them something like smaller in comparison. You can say to somebody, hey, I've got this huge, like 7-hour VOD. I wanna edit this down into YouTube content. Can you do it for me? And they might say, fuck no, that's a huge amount of work. And you might say, all right, well, I got like a 2-hour one. Will you do that? Smaller requests that follow an unreasonably big request seem more reasonable in comparison, and people tend to be more likely to agree to them. In a comparable point, people tend to, if you start with like working on constancy, if you start with a lowball price and then keep adding on desirable options, people tend to be more likely to be persuaded. So for example, here's a fun one. Like, this happens a lot with cars and car sales. You start with a lowball price, but you have all these features and everything that you want someone to agree to. So you give the car away at a much lower price than you expected. But then you kind of keep going along. And you say, hey, you know, what about satellite radio? How about heated seats? And so on and so on. And the person that initially agreed to buy the car for a much lower price is going to probably walk away spending more money than they expected. So here's this is kind of a fun sort of pseudoscience way that marketing tends to work. Oops, sorry, I have hiccups now. Give me a second, I'm gonna bring some water. Pseudoscience tends to work on a lot of these same principles, using stuff like scarcity, manufactured source credibility, sensational, vivid testimonials, and so on and so forth to get people to buy into situations where they otherwise would not. And the final subject here, prejudice and discrimination. This is, again, my actual area of expertise. I have to hold myself back and not gush about this for too long. So prejudice and discrimination, in general, we function based on stereotypes. These are a form of heuristic or mental shortcut that we have based on group membership. We make assumptions, positive and negative, about how someone will act based on how we perceive them to be and who we perceive them to be associated with. When you hold negative views towards someone of a group, we call that prejudice. And when we act on those views, we call that discrimination. Now, stereotypes can result in things like the ultimate attribution error, where you attribute individual negative acts to the attributions back to the group. So remember the fundamental attribution error. When it works on the individual level, you tend to attribute other people's behavior to their disposition and downweight the impact of the situation they're in. The ultimate attribution error is when you tend to attribute a person's individual actions all the way back out to their group. And again, these are things that people do pretty regularly. The nature of prejudice is that some would say that it's an evolved tendency. I disagree, and that does not mean that that does not mean that it is unavoidable or beneficial. Even if, and this is important, this is where I think that a lot of EbPsych kind of falls apart, in my opinion. This is my professional opinion as a professional content creator who was a doctor, is a doctor, was a lecturer. I think a lot of evolutionary psychology underestimates the amount of agency that individual people have. And when it comes to things like prejudice and discrimination, even if you want to say that, oh, well, group thinking and group dynamics and everything have an evolutionarily advantageous role, and that's why people do them, that does not mean that they are unavoidable or that they are beneficial. So even if we are wired to do something, it doesn't mean that it is necessarily good. Now, we tend to favor people that are in our group. Remember when we talked about upward social comparison? If someone in your group succeeds, you tend to feel good too, because we invest some level of our self-concept into the groups that we are part of. We also tend to view people that are in groups that we are not part of as being all alike. And a playful example here, and one that came up in chat, is when you see someone who plays a character in a fighting game or an archetype in a fighting game, and assuming all those people are alike because they're playing someone like a character that you don't, they're a different group, and it's easier to make these kinds of jokes about it, even when they're playful. When we treat outgroup members worse than in-group members, though, that is discrimination. Now, you can be prejudiced, though, without necessarily discriminating. And it's more likely that you would discriminate without realizing it. So how can you be prejudiced without discriminating? If you stop, you can have the attitude, but if you don't act on it, well, then you're not discriminating, but you are prejudiced. It's far more likely that people can be prejudiced or say they are not prejudiced and end up discriminating, especially when you have a society like ours that weights certain members of certain groups, especially racial and ethnic categories and gender, whether based on gender, race, ethnicity, so on and so forth, as having certain advantages. The structure of society is maintained by those the actions of individual people who might say that they are not prejudiced, but they still end up discriminating because the actual workings of the world that they live in are themselves discriminatory. And this can have huge impacts on people like women, gender minorities, cis women, trans men, gender and sexual minorities, and racial and ethnic minorities. And even subtle actions, or what we call microaggressions, can still accumulate over time. Remember when we talked about stress, we talked about hassles. Even individually small factors do weigh on us over time. And then eventually things get kind of rough. So what are the roots of prejudice? There's a lot of different theories. One is the scapegoat hypothesis. We need to have someone to blame. The just world hypothesis is that we would propose that we have a belief, a desire to see the world as fair, even when it's not. So we tend to blame the victim. If you encounter, for example, someone who's really committed to seeing the world as a fair place, might see a person discriminated against because of their racial or ethnic status, and then say, oh, well, it's not about who they are. That would be unfair. They didn't work as hard. Or they might see someone benefit from nepotism or racially discrepant hiring, and then say, oh, that person worked hard. That's why they got it. In general, we tend to like to think that the world is a fair place and that people that put in certain work people that put in the same work are going to get the same reward, but that's just not how it works because we live in hell. There's also the factor of conformity to social norms. Normal people can do fucked up stuff when fucked up stuff becomes normal. If the social norm that you're in is to be racially discriminatory, people will be racially discriminatory because that's the normal thing to do. And this can manifest in different ways. There's explicit prejudice, the stuff that you would report, and implicit prejudice that I could talk forever about because it's my area of expertise. There is actually a lot of debate on whether or not implicit prejudice is even a thing anymore. Because it turns out that it's actually tends to be fairly correlated with explicit prejudice. And that people that tend to have a automatic association or a implicit prejudice against certain groups tend to also be more likely to be directly prejudicial or discriminatory. It's just how things tend to break out. But there has been a lot of investment and a lot of money sunk into stuff like the implicit association test, which you can take at implicit.harvard.edu, and other things like the affect misattribution procedure or the AMP, and a bunch of other tools, because there is a lot of interest in the research community in breaking into sort of what we consider to be the unconscious mind, which is not necessarily the unconscious mind, at least I don't find it to be, especially because what's interesting about implicit prejudice in particular, especially stuff like the IAT score, is that people can self-report them. So if you've taken the IAT before, gonna actually jump over and go off the beaten course here for a second. Harvard.edu. No. Let's go to the good old Project Implicit. My students always got to jump out of this. So, what does the IAT actually look like? Let's see. Educational stuff. Where does the website go? Yes. If you go to the Project Implicit website, there's a bunch of different tests you can take. Let's take the race IAT. Is always the classic one that people use. The way the test works, you go through. I'm going to click through and decline all these questions. But you go through a set of demographic questions that the researchers on the website will use, and eventually, you get to the actual test. The IAT works by giving you two different sets of categories. You have words and you have pictures. And you'll go through a number of trials where you see if you can, yes, you can still use this. I know a little trick to be able to skip some of these blocks. At first, you start off with just sorting the words. So you'll sort good, you'll sort sad, you'll sort delight, you'll sort this. And then you get a combination of these. So in this case, I get a block of trials where I'm being asked to give these sort of Eurocentric faces versus Afrocentric faces and good or bad words. And then the way the test works is that it weights your relative reaction time, how you're doing it when you're in one set of pairings, and how you do it when those things are reversed. So now I have the bad and in the Eurocentric faces and the good and the Afrocentric faces. So again, huge amounts of work have been done. This website collects millions of data points a year. It's actually kind of cool. What it more or less breaks down to show is that in the aggregate, people tend to, again, be aware of their test results. People know when they are being slower or less accurate with certain pairings relative to others, which again kind of challenges the idea that this is outside of conscious awareness. But there are a number of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that can be predicted over and above just asking people what they're willing to self-report. So there's still some validity to these measures. So when I did teach this, when I taught this, the book, again, when I taught this, a lot of textbooks tend to focus on the drama around, especially the IAT or the implicit association test and implicit prejudice. The thing is that even though the aggregate and over time, it seems that the actual correlations between the IAT and behavior are smaller than initially estimated, they're still there, and they're highly robust. Like I said, the website collects millions of points of data every year that researchers go on and analyze. So, but there is still a lot of active conversation about this. It's a very interesting topic to get into. And you can really get into the weeds about the IAT and how it's scored. Trust me, I've taken whole courses on it. So how do we combat prejudice? Well, and there was another famous study that unfortunately I didn't have a good video for, but the Roberts Cave study, where kids at a summer camp were split up into groups. And this is what we call a minimal group paradigm. They were told, you guys are this group, you guys are this group, you're the purple parrots, you're the orange iguanas, go. And what they found was that these students tended to very rapidly develop factionalism. It's like amongst themselves became hyper competitive. And one way of breaking this down is to use jigsaw classrooms where people like might actually then later on in the camp be integrated into like where they have to pair up with members of the other group, or where people are given definite assignments and to encourage teamwork. And that would tend to, in these minimal group studies, break down the factionalism that was created by assigning people a group identity. Positive intergroup contact, even imagined positive intergroup contact, has been shown to be very good at actually combating prejudice. Group contact alone is not enough. It typically needs to be positive. And also, people can take certain things just out of the equation. So when I was in grad school, what my instructor, my principal, my PhD advisor would do is whenever she was looking at applications for new students, she would take all the demographic data about the person and just tell the people at the front office that were screening applications and not to send it to her. That way she could just blind herself to the applicant's race, sex, etc., and that allowed her to just evaluate them based on merit. Kind of an interesting way to do it, especially for someone who works in prejudice and discrimination. She just took that whole element out of the equation so she wouldn't have to factor or think about it. All right, and that's what I got for this week. This was, again, fun. I'm sorry I got a little bit into the weeds there. I tried to keep myself in check, but that's social psychology in its entirety, sort of. I do have it actually, I have taught social psychology, so once I finish up this class, that might be the next run, because like I said, it's my actual favorite area, and I thought it was going to be my career. So it's just fun to talk about. These are always fun to do, and hope you all enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. And as per usual, I'm going to go jump over into office hours. And next week, we're going to be talking about personality. It'd be, again, a little bit of fun. It's interesting talking about personality when your training is in social psychology, because the whole adage about social is that it's the power of the situation. Whereas personality will tell you that it's like, no, it's about individual factors of the person. And so social psychologists and personality psychologists have basically butted heads for as long as the two sub-areas have been around. But that's what I got for this week. So thank you all for hanging out. Again, it means a lot to me. Bye!